So the IMF report says a lot of things. And what it says about the loss to corruption being 5 to 6% of GDP, I believe it's primarily referring to the federal government, because the entire report is about the federal government. 5 to 6% of GDP is somewhere between 20 and $25 billion. I think so much of our economy is actually off the books or not part of the white economy, that it's actually hard to make these estimates of what that figure really is. We know it's substantial. And the one thing that I will say is, and in my mind, there is no doubt that the primary finger needs to be pointed at the federal government and at the political system in the country. The federal government, because you've got to remember that where this pertains to the provinces as well, ultimately it's run by a system that is controlled by people that represent the federal bureaucracy. And if there's one thing that I learned in those 5 years, it is that the greatest resistance to change also comes from the most senior members of the federal bureaucracy, of course, with many honorable exceptions. So this is true, whether that corruption is in the development budget, because the development budget model is controlled by the federal government. This is true whether that corruption is in the hiring model, because the public sector compensation and hiring model is one that the federal government controls. And this is true, for example, whether this is about corruption during taxation. Because as far as taxation is controlled, actually almost the entirety of the taxation regime is controlled by the federal government. I have seen and I have cancelled some spectacular contracts. And sometimes it is about corruption, or it seems about corruption. But sometimes it is also about the incompetence that comes from the inertia in a system that doesn't incentivize anyone to learn. The handing over of corruption, the handing over of contracts to favored parties is almost a function of the political system. I actually found this out when, after I left office, it was told to me that the anti-corruption agencies were trying to look for the tekadars or the contractors that I used in my constituency. And fascinatingly, coming from the background that I come, I'd actually never met or seen a tekadar or a contractor. And so I was only really learning the way some of the elements of corruption in the system work after I left, because of the sort of cases that were attempted to be made on me, right? Or because for the first time in 5 years, I was not investing 24/7 in trying to challenge this system. So that's one example. But, I talk about contracts that are structured out of actual incompetence. I remember a sole sourcing deal given to a hotel chain in Pakistan that stemmed from 1985, and where the structure of the contract was such that the annual lease for the hotel was also locked in at the rates of 1985, with the 10% increase only once a decade. And this contract was proposed to be renewed, and the person thumping the table for it was none other than one of our chief secretaries. It was staggering to me, right? Because the 1985 rates for something like a 4 to 5 star hotel that the hotel was leased at annually was something like 5 lakh or 500,000 rupees, right? It was eye-wateringly incompetent for someone to be able to even think that they could bring something like this to the competent. But again, I say that most of this and the big ticket items have almost always been in the federal government. I can only give you examples of how that system extends into the provinces. It slowed my ministry down towards the end, when it was very clear that we were facing the establishment and that the whispers of our government leaving were getting larger and louder. We had embarked on a very ambitious health reform agenda, and I was very proud of the things that we achieved. Things like universal health care, things like getting hospitals in the periphery to work through outsourcing them, things like devolving financial authority to BHUs by allowing them to retain the revenue that they earned through the parches that they gave to patients that came. But during the last 6 months, I remember that the secretary of my department, one day, in fact, in a meeting where we were discussing how to get some of the services in hospitals work, such as MRI services, and how the outsourcing process that we had approved from the cabinet needed to be expedited, he whispered in my ear to say, "Sir, NAB has been at the office." And I took him aside afterwards and said, "Was there any concern?" And he said, "There's no concern." But after that day, he refused to sign a single piece of paper that required taking a financial decision. And we've seen this. I'm not talking of. I won't just even talk of my time. The things that happened in our time, that it almost seems that the system makes happen again and again. I'll give you 3 examples. When we were doing COVID procurement, I remember the chief secretary coming to one of the initial meetings, and I was telling him, and I was telling the entire room, that for us to be able to procure dynamically in COVID was critical, because we were talking of thousands, tens of thousands of lives, potentially. These were the earliest days of COVID, when people were dropping like 9 pins in New York and London and Spain and Italy. And the chief secretary told me there, I remember he said openly in the meeting, "Sir, we will do it now, but 3 years later, we will all be hauled up for it." I won't ever forget those words, because I remember thinking, he's saying this and he will actually prioritize process over saving lives. But where he was coming from, he was right, because indeed, those COVID procurements were another area that were attempted to be tagged to me. Other examples that actually don't relate to my time. One was of a senior official in Punjab, Mr. Suleiman Ghani, who was arrested, I remember, for not signing or giving comments on a file 20 years earlier. Still don't know why or how. I know the gentleman is a friend of my father's, and I can vouch for his accountability. And it was clear to a blind person that this was being done for reasons other than those that should be reasons why you put in place accountability. So this is true. This is true across the system. This is why we have a civil service that gets people that are highly dynamic, but that as they progress through the system lose all dynamism and all decision-making power. And remember, as we use them to blackmail the system, we're not just achieving ulterior political objectives, we're also destroying the future of this country. If there was one government that tried to take on the sugar industry, for example, that was Imran Khan, at great personal cost, because it actually harmed one of his closest political relationships. But I think that what is true is that we all need to do a hell of a lot more if this country is to prosper. But let's point this finger where it needs to be pointed. This IMF report destroys everything that this government has claimed to do in the last 4 years. It not only talks about a political elite and specific political families and says that political leaders in government are responsible for the rent seeking in the sugar industry, which means it is directly pointing a finger at Mr. Shehbaz Sharif and Mr. Zardari. And it is their duty now either to take on the IMF or to accept and resign or to give up their interests in the sugar industry. You cannot have it any other way. But it doesn't just take on the politicians. It also basically destroys every element of the governance system that we've put in place. We talked about the bureaucracy. It calls the judiciary corrupt. It calls NAB an entity that has been used for attaining political objectives. It basically states that the powers of the FBR allow the FBR to be a vehicle for corruption. It talks of the amount of red tape that becomes a reason for corruption. And it even talks about the lack of accountability and transparency in entities like the SIFC. You tell me, what parts of our governance system does it not touch? And why is it that 3 days later, no one in this government, not one person has had any credible explanation or even a shred of an explanation to be able to say something in return? It may happen on paper and in letter, but it will not happen in spirit until we make a collective effort to actually commit and agree to a model in which strengthening all institutions and applying accountability and transparency to everyone is the way forward for this country. Oh, we did a lot, but this is not a 3-year problem. I think if you talk of intent, there is no one who would have had better intent towards getting rid of the stigma of corruption that this country is saddled with than Imran Khan. In fact, the argument often made against Imran Khan is that people and a certain section of the intelligentsia or even economists think that Imran Khan over-prioritizes tackling corruption as an issue. But this is not a 3-year problem to fix. Remember that in 80 years of Pakistan, the one government that has really attempted to be anti-status quo is PTI. And I can tell you that, yes, we've had many problems. And the reason we have problems is that if you look at politicians as a market, in today's Pakistan, and we've just seen the Haripur election, where under our nose, with our provincial government in place, an election has been stolen, right? What is the message that goes to any person that is actually trying to enter politics? The message that goes is that you do not belong in this field on principle or on capability. You belong on acceptability to the right quarters. And because that message has gone through for 80 years, 9 out of 10 people in the political arena are not there because of intent or capability or wanting to change the country. They're there because they're willing to toe the line. And I'm sorry, but anyone who has flexible principles that serve their own personal interest is not going to be part of the team that changes Pakistan. So it's true that we could have done more. We could have done more if we had more time, and we were limited by the fact that this entire political system is tainted by 80 years of trying to control politicians in the way that we see the worst example of today. Everyone blocks it, including all of the above that you said, as well as us as politicians and the bureaucracy. The problem is that we live in a country where, because we have all come to believe that this country can't be fixed, we take an individualist approach to trying to fix its problems by making sure that individually we're in a good place. So everyone's fighting for scarce resources. I spend a lot of time looking at absurd requests from the judiciary in terms of wanting money for themselves, but making absurd decisions in trying to control the executive authority of government. Too many politicians, unfortunately, end up having individual interests or even collective interests. And I think in terms of trying to gain acceptability in the system, they're willing to, on difficult reform, make compromises with different stakeholders in power. And I don't just refer to the army. As I said, I don't understand why everyone wants to keep the bureaucracy happy. I mean, I understand why, but I can promise you that with a bureaucracy that is trained only in how not to act and how to ensure that inertia is the driving factor of Pakistan's governance model, that nothing will change. That is why you and I are taxed at up to 50% and even more. But the senior bureaucracy is not willing to tax its own pensions or contribute towards their own pensions. So I can't actually absolve anyone. But what I can say, and we've seen this over the last 3 years, that one strong institution, the establishment, cannot make a country functional. If we have to make this country functional, then we have to, of course, have a strong army, because we live in a very tough neighborhood, but we need to have an independent judiciary, and that requires rolling back the 27th and 26th Amendment. We need to have a political culture where independently minded politicians can come and not pay for their independence of thoughts with losing their elections. We need to have a bureaucracy where dynamism is rewarded and not nagged. And we need to have other institutions such as FBR and such as NAB and such as the power sector that are also willing to take risk. They're all part of a jigsaw puzzle. They're all different pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that can only make a picture that you and I like if they're all in place. It's because of the system we've designed, but it's also not just politicians. You remember the controversy I got into with the supposed letter that I had written to the IMF, that I never wrote to the IMF, but where what was interesting was that I was taken through a public trial for trying to do my job of protecting the interests of the province that I represented. But what is interesting and what no one wanted to talk about, while they wanted to talk about an illegally recorded phone call and the conclusions they drew from that, no one wanted to talk about the contents of my letter, when it was actually the federal government that was not executing its part of the bargain in the IMF deal, not us. We had signed it. Where no one wants to talk about or still talk about that if we want to develop the most backward area of the country, i.e. the former FATA, that we have to invest resources in that. Where no one actually wanted to talk about something that I said multiple times, that people have a problem with my letter, but they don't have a problem with something that I revealed, and no one denied it. That the federal finance minister and the finance secretary used to tell me, you know, don't leave a surplus, just tell us you leave a surplus, right? Because to them, it was not the commitment to the IMF that was important. It was the action of signing on the dotted line. And they were actually telling me that it was okay to violate the deal, right? We have created a culture where no one trusts us and where we are only acting on what our international partners tell us as long as we need it in the short term. We have no intent to use it to our long-term advantage. Otherwise, many of the reforms that the IMF tell us or the World Bank tells us, we would do ourselves. Like we initiated pension reforms in KP, not at the call of the IMF or the World Bank, but because I saw that as the most ambitious but achievable reform that we could do at the time. If you're going to do things because others ask you and they're twisting your arms, and you know they're the right things to do, but you don't want to do them, you will always backtrack at the end. No, it isn't. Countries have done it. You know, if we actually take the example of countries that have actually made up their mind to transform their fates, they've done it in a generation or so. Singapore was a city-state, and the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, when Singapore was forced out of the Federation of Malaysia, broke down on TV because he felt the state wouldn't survive. But Singapore used that as motivation to create a state and an economy that is a global powerhouse today. We've seen the same happen in Korea. We've seen the same happen in Japan after World War II. We've seen the Indian economy transform after they decided to commit unequivocally to open market principles in 1991. We've seen the transformation of China after the death of Mao, when they decided to create their own brand of socialist capitalism. But we seem to be caught in the middle because we almost never commit to any one path. And you can see that lack of commitment today. This IMF report was not something the IMF made voluntarily. They were asked to carry out a governance and corruption diagnostic. But once carried out, the government tried to fight tooth and nail to have the report not published, and God knows what changes they've made in it. And not a single word until today about the allegations, not a single word about the flaws it has pointed out, not a single word about what the government intends to do to implement. And if they intend to do nothing, then why don't they just resign? Till how long are we just going to see a government in place that keeps on not only fudging figures to the IMF, but also fudging elections on a daily basis, like we just saw in Haripur and Lahore? It will plod along. The IMF said there's no investment coming. The government has said they will bring in $100 billion. We keep on seeing pictures of the senior leadership signing MOU after MOU. But we keep on reading headlines about multinational company after multinational company leaving the country. We've seen the pharma companies. We saw Procter and Gamble. We've seen the oil companies actually exit Pakistan. The latest news is that Barrick, actually fought for the Recounted investment for almost 20 years, is now thinking that it is too risky an investment because of Pakistan's political economy and will probably offload its share. So this actually tells you about the investability of the economy, and the investability of an economy, more than anything else, I think tells you about the health of the economy. And if you don't want to look at foreign actors, just name me one local business family or one local business house that is putting its money in the country, that is actually increasing investment in the country. There are none. So we can actually pretend that everything is hunky-dory. We can pretend that the 2024 election carried an iota of legitimacy. But the truth is that the atmosphere of political repression and the need to destroy institutions that are all necessary to be able to maintain a regime that has no legality and no acceptability is not only destroying those institutions and the political culture of the country, it's also ensuring that the economy stays destroyed and the country in its foreign policy dealings is hamstrung because it needs to accept what many of our foreign partners tell us without pushing back where it is not in Pakistan's interest, because they have no choice, because the only legitimacy they can draw is from international partners. No, it is two separate things. I think what the IMF is talking about is the $30 billion of imports that disappeared from the figures, which is a statistical discrepancy. Where the federal government is not answering 100 questions, it may not answer the 101st question. As far as the issue of the Kohistan scandal is concerned, which I don't believe is mentioned in the IMF, but if it is, I think it does reflect on our system. No one has ever bothered to figure out what the details of that scandal are. Interestingly, to my understanding, because I checked on it, because it is clear that some of what happened during our tenure, and I checked with many of the officials to say that we used to look at books, that I personally used to look at the financial books of the province every month. How could these accounts from which the money disappeared not even come into the radar of the finance department? And it is because the entire discrepancy was happening in the Auditor General office through an audit system that is archaic and that does not know how to actually fix the flaws within it. So I would actually say that, to my knowledge, there's no one senior in the system, either in the Auditor or Accountant General office or in the KP government, that was aware of this, because this was a blind spot. It was a blind spot that was discovered by district officers and district staff who took advantage of it over years. And it was not an entry that was appearing either in the expenditure or the revenue of the province, which is what we saw. But there is a serious systemic question if in the Accountant General system, a flaw such as this, where clearly the controls were weak, was not discovered for years. But what is also in how we deal with these issues politically, I have been told and confirmed by the Accountant General office that discrepancies or frauds of a similar nature have also happened across all other provinces. Because you can imagine that if such a flaw exists and it is so easy to flout it, it is easy to flout it everywhere. And it was flouted, but unfortunately, only what happened in KP has been highlighted, because the intent even here has not been to fix the flaw. The intent over here has been to point fingers at the KP government, because this current regime considers it a bigger enemy than either India or the militants that it's fighting. You will have to ask the KP anti-corruption team, because I think some of the things they did in targeting their own colleagues have also been a joke. So I can't really say I'm the biggest fan of the KP anti-corruption setup or of any of the anti-corruption setups, because frankly, in the provinces, they emanate from archaic laws. But what's common to the entire anti-corruption system, whether it is the provincial anti-corruption setups, whether it is NAB or the FIA, or the new NCCIA that was branched out of the FIA to deal with violations on social media, that all of these entities become political tools. And when they become political tools, they also become potential avenues of increased corruption. And there is no better example of that than the NCCIA, which has been on paper created to deal with violations of on social media. But we have seen it target ex-cricket captains of the country, because they spoke against the head of the cricket board, who also happens to head the ministry that the FIA falls under. And we have also seen a big bribery and corruption scandal within the NCCIA, where this government, as illegitimate as it is, has been forced to dismiss large chunks of the top brass because they were using their positions to take bribes from people.